It's a great pleasure to introduce my colleague Robb MacCoun. Robb is professor of public policy in the Goldman School, and he's also professor of law at Bolt Hall. Robb's been heavily into drugs for a long time in 3 or 4 different ways. He's also been involved in judicial decision-making, observing it from the bench, from juries, from a variety of vantage points. He's been involved in a whole series of research activities that have connected his interests in cognitive research and social psychology. So let me turn the session over to Robb on the general topic of micromotives and macro behavior. Robb?
I put up on the screen an article that Peter Reuter and I co-authored with Tom. The article has nothing to do with this session. I'm putting it up on the screen because I can. And I've also put it on T-shirts and my Christmas cards, my family's Christmas cards. And I read the Nobel Committee's materials very carefully. They don't explicitly mention this article in the discussion of the prize. I think if you read between the lines, they still don't mention this article. This article is a real jewel on my CV, and I think at best we can say it hasn't harmed Tom's CV. But I did want to take a minute to just say something about what it's actually like to collaborate with Tom. Tom hasn't had a lot of co-authors, and I think in hindsight we can say that's probably a good thing for the world because he's done so well on his own. But I did have the opportunity, I believe 2 different summers, Tom was in residence at Rand when I worked at Rand, and we got to work together on a project. And my meetings with Tom took 2 forms, and one form was absolutely delightful, and that form was a series of lunches that we had at a nearby Mexican restaurant and dinners with Alice. And these were extremely comfortable, relaxed sessions in which Tom made me feel like we were old college friends or something. I mean, there was nothing intimidating about those sessions at all. We also had working meetings where we actually met in an office with Peter to talk about the project, and these were much more terrifying for me. So more of the scary stuff. Tom, so what's it like to actually watch Tom think? Tom is capable of long periods of silence while he's thinking, and sort of a Zen-like silence. And to be in the room with him while this silence is taking place is a little unnerving. First, Peter and I were wondering, do we actually feel heat coming off of Tom as he's thinking? We thought maybe we actually felt like heat coming off. Tom would be thinking for long periods of time, and while we were waiting for his thought to come out, it's a real puzzle as to what you should be doing while Tom is thinking. And sort of my internal thought process was, oh my God, Tom Schelling is thinking 3 feet away from me. I guess I should be thinking too. But I should be thinking smart thoughts. So not just think, but I should think something really smart. And this is, of course, paralyzing. And then, so as the more I would think, the more this would move from the emotion centers in the back of the brain up to the frontal cortex. And the frontal cortex would say, there's really no point in your thinking. Just let Tom think and try to stay out of the way. And then Tom would say something brilliant and insightful, and we would try to write it down as fast as we could. So it was a wonderful experience collaborating with Tom. That's, of course, not what we're here to talk about. We're here to talk about some of Tom has taken his work in many directions over the years, and we're going to talk about some of the directions, as Charlie Wolf referred to, some of the stuff that's the non-scary stuff. And most of you are probably familiar with some of the transitions that Tom made in his thinking, but sort of the way I think of it in terms of 3 of his most famous books is that the strategy of conflict really took seriously the idea of moving from zero-sum games to positive-sum games. The book Micromotives and Macro Behavior moved from 2 players to many different players and really introduced various ways in which there can be unanticipated emergent properties of end-person situations. It's also the first intellectual book that I bought that a professor didn't make me buy, that I bought all on my own, and so I always think of that, and I'm glad I bought it. The funny thing is, as a psychologist, I read the book and I thought, oh, now I know how economists think about the world, and it took a while to disabuse me of that understanding. But and then Tom's book, Choice and Consequence, has a number of essays introducing the idea that actors themselves can be sort of usefully construed in terms of multiple selves. And we're going to talk, so we'll talk about the perspectives of these two books during our session. Tom's work on micromotives and macro behavior is well known. One of the things it's most well known for is that Tom's methodology was actually fairly crude by contemporary standards, by current standards. His simulation strategy was to use dimes and pennies on a checkerboard. As you can see, some people have tried to make the simulations more realistic since Tom's original work. And I'm not sure whether the more realistic simulations have improved on the initial insights. But we're going to look at several examples of this kind of work today. I want to just spend a few minutes. I'm not going to give a full presentation, but I want to talk just briefly about a model we'll be talking a lot about today. And it's already been referred to in earlier sessions. This is the tipping point model. And just talk about it from my perspective as a social psychologist and some work I'm currently doing. Now, Tom, if you go back to Tom's essays on segregation, housing segregation, Tom could have very plausibly argued that in taking into account our neighbors, that our sensitivity to our neighbors might just be some sort of linear function of how many people are different than us. In fact, a very reasonable, plausible assumption he could have made is that it's a diminishing marginal impact of each additional neighbor, so that the first neighbor has a big impact on you. Tom didn't make that move. There are many formal models that are very influential in social psychology that model social influence in that way, as the diminishing marginal impact. Tom did something very different. Tom proposed a threshold notion, a nonlinear threshold rule that people don't change until some sort of tipping point is made. And I just briefly wanted to mention some work I've been doing showing how useful this threshold notion is for making sense of lots of data sets in social psychology. And in order to do so, I've actually been drawing also on Dan McFadden's work and on related mathematical models as a way to formalize the notion of a threshold. And I'm not going to go through all the parameters here, but I'm putting up the formula just because the economists in the room will recognize this as very closely related to Dan McFadden's model. The key here is that B is a threshold parameter here. How many people differ from me in the social situation? And a threshold model turns out to be first of all, it's a very flexible formulation. And the idea I've been playing with is that the threshold itself, the operative threshold, or what I think of as a legal psychologist is the burden of proof in any social situation, varies according to topic, so that for certain topics, one group in society is more likely to sort of hold the burden of proof, and for other topics, it's another group. And so using this model, and also looking at a parameter that considers that there might be a lot of consensus about where the threshold lies. We may all think it's exactly at 50%, or there may be very little consensus, and this is what I call a clarity parameter. You can get very steep threshold-like phenomena with this model, or much more shallow behavior. And I'm not going to bore you with the details, but I've looked at 20 or so classic data sets in social psychology and fit this model compared to these diminishing marginal impact models. And the threshold model consistently fits better. Even when I cripple the model by tying its hands behind its back by throwing away, I mean, I have 3 free parameters in the full equation I put up, but if I get rid of 2 of the parameters and just use a 1-parameter model, it really does, not only does it fit the data well, but it tells you something, or at least I believe it tells you something about where the threshold lies in a given situation. And you can compare across different situations, jury behavior, different types of social situations. And what you find is that the threshold varies in some, I think, understandable ways across situations. So I believe that Tom's notion of a threshold or a tipping point is a very powerful idea. And we're going to see some very explicit examples of that in the later presentations. Our session today, we're going to start out with Dan McFadden, who, of course, is the 2000 Nobel laureate in economics and Berkeley's own economics professor. Alex, I spelled your name wrong, didn't I? Should there be another A in there? Sorry, it should be M-A-A-S. Alex, who's a new economist at Haas School of Business, is going to talk, I got the 2 A's in Haas, is going to talk about some work he's been doing testing Tom's ideas for looking at segregation. And Mark Kleiman, who's up visiting us from UCLA for the day, is going to talk about some important new work he's been doing on criminal justice theory and deterrence theory. And in various ways, we want to illustrate ways in which Tom's ideas are being used in the social sciences. I did want to mention Robb Willer, one of our other participants, is quite ill today. Nothing serious, but he wasn't able to participate. Robb expresses his tremendous admiration for Tom and sends his regrets. And I really encourage you to check out Robb's work. Robb's work is really quite interesting. He's a young sociologist, a junior sociologist here at Cal. So with that, I'm going to move over to Dan's slides and introduce Dan McFadden. Here we go.
This session could be titled Mind Games because it's really about Tom's work on game theory, or the insights of game theory applied to the consumer. And the book, Micromotives and Macro Behavior, is primarily about how consumers relate to their peers. But the other part, and very substantial part of his work, had to do with how consumers deal with themselves. Since Adam Smith's evocation of the invisible hand, economists have understood that interactions between economic agents can lead to social consequences that are beyond the intentions of the individuals. Economists have also recognized, at least since Pagoo, Lindow, Viner, and Coase, that the invisible hand is not always on the wheel and sometimes wanders. Now, what Tom's work has done, an important theme of it, has been to add some corporal substance to the invisible hand to flesh it out. First, in the relationship between the consumer and society, where Adam Smith saw the hand as orchestrating the social consequences of the actions of individual agents, with this social environment providing some constraints on individual behavior and thus guiding those actions, Tom saw this as more of a handshake, a two-way interaction in which consumers influence society in unintended ways, but society also influences consumers in ways that can be surprising and which society or marketers may in fact use to influence them. What Tom started and characterized in micromotives and macro behavior was really a new science. You might call it the science of consumer ecology. and I think the interesting comments that have been made and will be made about tipping points and how consumers interact with others will illustrate some of this in a great deal more detail. Secondly, in Tom's work, he saw the consumer as an imperfect commander of his own inner children. And then this commander has to design mechanisms to control the children's demand for immediate gratification and to correct their inadequate attention to future consequences. In approaching this subject, Tom was saved from Freudian mysticism, the id and the ego, by an acute eye for real-life exemplars. And these insights have fueled the explosion of behavioral economics and neuroeconomics research on internal inconsistency and self-control. When Tom first wrote about these topics, mostly in the beginning in the 60s and into the early 80s, they were on the fringes of economics. I think many economists at that time found them an uncomfortable challenge to the treasured axioms of consumer sovereignty and rationality. But today, with accumulated behavioral evidence from cognitive psychology and behavioral economics, it's widely accepted that consumers are, in fact, social animals with a tenuous grasp on rationality. Here are a few of the important writings in this area of Tom's work. I'm going to draw upon a few of these, and if you want me to go back to this at the end so you can write things down, you can. I'll do that. Otherwise, just Google Tom. Let me concentrate on the relationship between the consumer as a commander and the multiple selves or inner children. My term, multiple selves, was used earlier today. This circumstance is one in which, rather than an invisible hand, it's really the visible hand of a command organization. In this case, it's an organization internal to the individual. It's has analogs in say Oliver Williamson's theory of how organizations are organized. And I'm going to quote, and I'm going to read an extended quote from Tom's article. It's called "Enforcing Rules on Oneself," and that's from the Journal of Law, Economics, and Organization, I think around 82. He begins by giving a very cogent description of what you're looking for when you design a contract. How does one devise a contract that, I think I missed a word, is easily enforced on each party by the other? How are rules designed for the behavior of each party and the incentives attached to compliance so that the temptations and opportunities for noncompliance are minimized? How does an agreement make room for exceptions, for discretionary judgment about what is required, and for penalties on violations so that the whole arrangement need not collapse upon the first failure? And that itself, I think, is a very interesting insight into the design of contracts, the notion that there needs to be robustness and a repeated, an extensive game aspect to a design of a contract. But then he goes on to say, I am interested in the special case of rules that people impose on themselves. I'm thinking of people who wish not to oversleep, not to lose their temper, and he gives many other good examples. I'm also thinking of people who wish to determine performance, not abstinence, such as pursuing some self-improvement regimen like exercise or study, who wish not to procrastinate but to prepare their lectures and write their papers on time. That really hit me hard. The question is how people devise effective rules to govern their future behavior. And then he goes on to talk about this quite a bit, but here's the key to a lot of it. Sometimes the structure of the situation makes it possible to burn the bridge today that one would use for escape tomorrow. Sorry. Well, how do you do that? Well, and I'm going to mention a few of the things that Tom talks about and expand on them a little bit. The idea of self-command is effectively to find devices where you can pre-commit to behavior that in prospect and in rational discourse, meditation you think you wish to do. One way to do it is to try to close doors, close exits to behavior that you anticipate could be unacceptable. You would try to set up contracts for yourself. One way that you can do that is through wagers and hostages. Let me explain that. It's very difficult to write a binding contract with your inner children. They are children after all. But what you can do is deal with other people in a way which makes it very costly for you to yield to a violation of behavior by one of your inner children. You can do it in a direct way by, if you want to stop smoking, for example, offer that you will pay someone a substantial amount of money if they catch you smoking. Another way, kind of similar thing, is to essentially give up hostages to the other side. Tom gives the example of telling an intimate and embarrassing secret to another person with the instruction that they can reveal that if you're found to violate your pre-commitments. Another is to basically turn over your ability to control circumstances to others, to relinquish authority, relinquish your own ability to make choices. In addition, you can remove temptations. Tom cites the example of an acquaintance who was was extremely productive, and Tom inquired as to why, and the response was, "Well, I'm under house arrest, and what else is there to do but write papers?" So it was very productive. So you remove temptations, and that may encourage the behavior you want. A device which is very common in ordinary market behavior is the idea of cooling off. You say, okay, I'm going to go look at new cars, but I'm not going to buy one today. I'm going to cool off first and make sure that I have a choice that I really want to make. And of course, the response of the auto salesman is to say, well, of course, you may want to consider this, but if you sign today, before you leave here, I have a really, really good deal for you. So consumers have to not only adopt these strategies, they have to be aware that they are in an environment in which the game is to try to overcome those strategies. And finally, an important part of self-control is the socialization of behavior. The long tradition in economics is of the consumer as an island, someone who has their own preferences, born in full array at birth and never altered thereafter, and uninfluenced by the environment. And the alternative is that people are social animals. They respond to others, and their preferences as well as their behavior are responsive to others. I want to say a little more about that with an example which I think is a very good characterization of how people contract for social behavior and what's involved in sometimes deviating from those contracts. And the model is of the peloton in bicycle racing. Most of you know how this works. It takes a lot of energy to bicycle by yourself and deal with the wind resistance. But if you can get behind other riders and draft on other riders, you can save a great deal of energy. So that when bicycle racing happens, the riders tend to group in these tight pelotons. It's in the end a competitive game, so that eventually some riders will try to win the race by breaking away from the peloton. But by and large, that's a very limited possibility. You would typically lose unless you're very, very acute in your timing of a breakaway. And otherwise, the energy-saving way to proceed is to stay behind the other riders. By the way, one of the features of pelotons, which I think is also perhaps instructive for understanding how consumers deal in social groups, is the pelotons don't have elected or designated leaders. It's an informal rotation. And so there's no, and so affiliation is voluntary and leadership is voluntary. Nevertheless, it's a relatively stable social organization. So this kind of an organization, the peloton, I think, is an example of how consumers behave a lot of the time. They limit their own choices, and they yield responsibility to others, namely the current leader of the peloton. They stay in line. They're accountable to the network norms, and this is in general a efficient decision-making strategy, an energy-conserving strategy, and for consumers for whom, as Herb Simon says, a wealth of information creates a poverty of attention. One of the most precious things we have is our attention budget, and if we can find ways to save energy in making decisions, we're usually better off. So until the opportune time for a breakaway comes, and you do something different, in fact, it's in some sense meta-rational to forego individual choice and follow the herd. So to conclude then, in terms of Tom Schelling's work on consumers, his research on consumers, he really anticipated two major developments in behavioral economics. The first is, as I've just been discussing, that consumers are social animals. They live in social networks, often voluntary, where affiliation, imitation, reciprocity, trust, and social norms are very important in controlling their behavior, and as, going back to the other part of this, as a device for controlling their own desires for instant gratification. If the group doesn't smoke, it's much easier for yourself not to be tempted to pick up a cigarette. If there is a social norm for savings and devices for savings, then you're much more inclined to save. And the second anticipation from Tom, which I think has had increasing influence in behavioral economics, is that consumers are imperfect managers of their own behavior. They have irrationalities which are predictable, even to themselves, and they use a variety of mechanisms, particularly some of which I mentioned, but using socialization and giving hostages are prime examples of how self-command is done. Now, I would say that laboratory and natural experiments and neuroeconomics experiments have shown Tom to be an astute and far-sighted student of human behavior. Many experimentalists, such as Danny Kahneman, have been noted for striking laboratory results which have shown economists that they need to think outside the box. But I think in terms of the original insights into the limitations of the classical model, you look to people like Herb Simon and Tom Schelling, and they had it early, and they pretty much had it all. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to set up the slide for Alex. Okay. Alex, do you want to stand at the podium for this?
Okay, thank you. Well, I want to thank the organizers for inviting me here. It's a real privilege to be talking to you all amongst this company. I was told not to make my presentation too researchy, nor to have too many slides, and I think I probably failed on both counts, unfortunately, but we'll see. My focus is on an empirical test of the Schelling tipping point model. I think when you read micromotives and macrobehavior, you read the theories, and at least in my case, they ring true. You read it, my reaction is, well, that just seems right. So what I'm going to discuss today is that when taken to the data, the Schelling tipping point model appears to have a lot of empirical relevance for our understanding of the evolution of neighborhoods. The tipping point model has been used in a variety of contexts, including consumer behavior, marriage, understanding marriage, religion, a lot of different. It's been applied to a lot of different contexts. What I'll discuss is the model as it was originally written in terms of understanding the racial composition of neighborhoods. Now, as you know, racial segregation is a defining feature of urban neighborhoods in the United States, and a lot of studies have shown that black children raised in segregated neighborhoods tend to have worse outcomes, including lower education, worse test scores, lower employment, lower wages, higher crime rates. Now, I think there may not be uniform agreement to what extent these correlations are causal, but a major goal of public policy over the last 4 decades has been to reduce segregation in neighborhoods, schools, and at the workplace. The efficacy of integration policies, I think, depends on the underlying forces that are leading to and sustaining segregation, which is why I think this question is important. In the Jim Crow era, I think that legal and institutional forces certainly enforce segregation. In more recent times, a lot of analysts have suggested that preferences of whites to live in neighborhoods with lower minority shares could be the driving force for segregation, and this is an idea that I think originates, or at least was stated early by Schelling. So the tipping point model has been discussed, I think, in several talks. So I'm just going to say something briefly. Schelling observed that segregation can occur from individual choices, even when most whites readily tolerate living in a neighborhood with a higher fraction of minorities. The idea is that social interactions and preferences can generate a nonlinear system. And once the fraction of minorities in a neighborhood reaches or exceeds a critical tipping point, a cascade of white flight will lead to complete racial isolation. I've drawn a little kind of schematic diagram here at the bottom, which kind of shows the implication. There's 3 equilibrium. The two on the left and the right are the stable equilibrium. That's sort of the low minority equilibrium and the high minority equilibrium. In the middle, there's an unstable equilibrium, which is the integrated one. And if you begin at the integrated equilibrium, a small deviation to either side is going to lead the neighborhood to towards one of the other two. Now, what I forgot to actually say this. The work that I'm going to be talking about now is joint with David Card, who's at Berkeley, and Jesse Rothstein, who is at Princeton. And what we have done is to try to test the observable implications of this kind of model. And we're looking at census tract data between 1970 and 2000. And the basic idea is really straightforward, that if there is tipping, there must be some point, which may be specific to a city or to a time period, some point m star, such that when the initial minority share is above that point, the white share will fall fast. And so what we do in this work is to try to examine whether such a point exists in different cities and how to examine whether this is something that is an irregularity. So let me just show you an example of some cities. Here's Chicago between 1970 and 1980. The x-axis is the percent minority in 1970, and the y-axis is the change in the white population. It's not quite the change in the minority share. It's the change in the white population divided by initial total population. Just think about it as the change in the white population. And the dots are averages of data points, which are tracks. And what you can see is that at around 5%, just maybe 6% minority share, initial minority share in 1970, there's a discontinuous change in the white population. This pattern is what we would expect as the prediction from the Schelling tipping point model, as the aggregate prediction of this kind of model, that there is a threshold point such that beyond that the neighborhoods experience some kind of white flight. This turns out to be a very regular pattern in different cities. I'm just going to show you 3 examples. Here's Los Angeles between 1970 and 1980. And again, there's this discontinuous point such that if minority share initially is beyond it, you're seeing a substantial white flight. And then in more recent times, just pick Nashville between 1990 and 2000, and again you see such a point. It turns out that most cities have this pattern, and it holds on average. So what we do in our paper is we come up with a procedure for picking out that line, that solid line, which is what we call the candidate tipping point, and then we take all cities and we deviate their minority share initially from the candidate tipping point, and then plot the change in the in the white population on the y-axis. And you can see that on average, if you choose such a point, there exists on average a discontinuous change in the white population at some threshold point. So that's the basic idea of this work, and we interpret the evidence as really supporting this kind of model. Just to give you a sense of what the tipping points are like, between 1970 and 1980, they were roughly 12% minority share, 80 to 90, about 14%, getting to 14%, and then 92,000 approaching 15%. So they've risen slightly. You can also see that they have a fairly large standard deviation. They vary across city and over time. And one thing we've done is we've investigated what do tipping points depend on. If you write down the Schelling tipping point model, you can see that they should depend on the attitudes of whites and minorities. And so one thing we've done is to go to data from the General Social Survey and computed an index of race attitudes of whites. So for example, how do white residents in different cities respond to the question, should interracial marriage be outlawed? That's clearly a reflection of attitude. So what we find is that more tolerance amongst whites leads to higher tipping points, which is what you would expect. And then here are some other variables that we've considered. Higher crime rates in the city leads to lower tipping points. I shouldn't say leads to, is associated with a history of riots. So we looked at the riots in the 1960s, the cumulative number of riots in the 1960s. Cities that had more riots have lower tipping points, and we've looked at other variables. Now, I want to say something about what are the policy implications about these findings and really about the model more generally. I mean, what can public policy do in light of this model? Now, I want to distinguish between two different forms of the Schelling tipping point model. The one on the left is really the one I already discussed, which I'm just going to call the unstable version. And you can think of it as there's a peak and there's a marble at the top of the peak, and that's the integrated neighborhood. And any perturbation, any kind of random shock is going to make the marble go to either 0% minority or 100% minority. And the model has the implication that there's actually fairly little that policymakers can do, because any policy that increases the minority share in a neighborhood will be swimming upstream against these forces that are bringing the neighborhoods down to either 0% minority or 100% minority. What we've also considered is versions of the model, which I'm calling semi-stable, which is that they're tipping really in one direction. And you can get these kind of models from introducing something like demand specificity. So a neighborhood that has a lot of nice Victorian houses, for example, has the potential to lead to this kind of equilibrium, because there are some white residents who are going to be willing to live in a higher minority neighborhood to live in a nice Victorian house. And these sorts of models, I think, have a somewhat more optimistic, allow for a larger role of policy, because a neighborhood can be integrated so long as it doesn't exceed the tipping point. But if it's to the left of the tipping point, as in that blue marble, it will be stable. And so some of the work that we're doing is to try to understand which of these models appears to best explain the data. And this question is important because tipping points have risen over time. And the 3 points at the top are national averages that I already showed you, but we've actually done some work going back to 1940 looking at applying the same methods, looking at Chicago, Detroit, and Cleveland, which show that the tipping point in 1940, at least in Chicago and Detroit, was just about 0. I mean, it's pretty extreme. You get one minority resident or one minority household in a neighborhood, and it seems to flip, whereas later on that's no longer the case. So to the extent that tipping points are rising, if we have the semi-stable version of the model, there's more potential for integration. How am I doing? Here are the histograms for these cities that we've pooled all cities together, and I'm showing you a histogram of the minority share in Chicago, Cleveland, Detroit from 1950 to 1990, and you can see that these tipping points, the rising tipping points correspond to in the cross section to more neighborhoods that are integrated. In 1950, you see that there's a large mass of neighborhoods that are 0% minority. Now what happens is that nationally the minority population has risen, so you're seeing just more minority tracts in 1990, but it's less bimodal, to the extent that you're seeing kind of by 1990 some massive tracts around kind of below the tipping points in those cities, which are those black axes. So this kind of suggests already that the semi-stable version of the model there may be something to it, because as the tipping points rise, you're seeing more and more neighborhoods which are integrated at least to the left of those tipping points. And we've also done some work just trying to explicitly test this idea. This is the cumulative density function of minority share in 1980, 90, 2000, and 70 relative to the 1970 tipping point. And what we've done is we selected neighborhoods or tracts that are just to the left of the tipping point in 1970, within 3 percentage points, and just to the right, and then plotted their plotted the CDF, or the we showed the distributions of these neighborhoods in subsequent decades. And what you can see is that neighborhoods to the left of the tipping point are the distribution is shifted to the left, which is a reflection of tipping. But what you can also see is that over time, neighborhoods to the left of the tipping point are not trending towards 0% minority. If anything, the minority share is increasing, which again suggests that tipping appears to go in one direction. So to conclude, we find strong evidence in support of the Schelling tipping point model. The extent of tipping seems to have declined a little bit between the 70s and the 90s, but it remains significant and practically significant. Neighborhoods appear to retain an integrated character so long as they remain below the tipping point, suggesting that policies oriented towards maintaining stable neighborhoods can derive some justification from this result. That's it. Thanks.
So, you just like it? I don't know how, but I'm sure there's a way. Is there a way to blank the screen until he's ready to use it?
Oh, terrific. Thank you. All right. Well, that was a hard act to follow. I got somewhat different instructions from Robb than Joseph Farrell seems to have gotten. So I wasn't told to talk about how Tom Schelling changed my life. But the precedent having been set, I might as well tell the story. I was a senior doing economics, political science, and philosophy in 1972, and it sort of decided I didn't want to go to graduate school in any of those things and was resigned to law school. But the economics senior seminar at Haverford, run by the department chair, Ho Hunter, consisted of reading every week a different recent piece of literature. And 1972, if you'll cast your mind back, was a pretty fertile time for interesting papers in economics. We read Baumol on unbalanced growth. We read Akerlof on lemons. We read Olson on collective action. We read Mike Spence's first paper on market signaling. And then we read a paper from the public interest called On the Ecology of Micromotives. And that was so mind-blowing that I went to my department chair after the seminar and said, okay, I have to learn how to do this. And he said, well, Schelling teaches at the Kennedy School. And I said, the where? And the rest is history. But the assignment I actually got from Robb, and I'm always obedient to what Robb says, was to talk about how Tom Schelling has influenced my work on drugs and crime. However, since it's late and since we have a limited amount of time, it seems to me to be more convenient for me to review and explicate all the ways, all the work I've done on drugs and crime that wasn't influenced by Tom Schelling. Would you like to hear it again? As the part that is due to Tom Schelling, I'd put it in 6 categories. Non-zero-sum games, vicarious problem solving, imperfect rationality, focal points, positive feedbacks and tipping, and simple simulations using checkerboards. And so let me just go through those. So the first blinding insight when you start to think about crime and you've read some Schelling is that most of the description of the crime problem and the enforcement problem is very much in the cops and robbers mode. It assumes that there's a zero-sum game between criminals and enforcers. We catch them or we don't. Well, but that's clearly not right if you think about it for just a second. The enforcers and the criminals, given that enforcement and punishment are costly, enforcers and criminals have a mutual interest in not having to punish and in not being punished. And therefore, enforcers may want to telegraph their punches. They might, for example, want to put up a sign saying, this is a zero-tolerance zone for X, rather than simply deciding that they're going to arrest everybody who does X in the area and waiting for them to find out on their own that X is forbidden. As a slightly earlier sage than Then Tom Schelling explained, don't just strike the rock, talk to the rock. So the direct communication of deterrent threats seems to me a central and very much underappreciated point in all sorts of enforcement efforts. Okay, vicarious problem solving. This is one I think that hasn't actually been mentioned so far today, but seems to be quite central. And it's the notion that if you want to strategize in some situation, you have to figure out what problem the other party to the transaction is trying to solve. Or as Feynman is supposed to have said about the way he came up with Feynman diagrams, I just asked myself, well, if I were a proton in that situation, what would I do? It's probably easier, if you're not Feynman, to think about what human beings would do. So if you're trying to think about breaking up a drug market, which is one of the things I've been thinking about for quite a long time, it makes sense to ask, well, if I were running a drug market, what would I need? What are the factors of production in retail drug dealing? And then you can think, well, okay, if I'm now if I'm on the other side of that game, which of those factors can I make relatively scarce and at the least cost? Well, that simple question turns out to lead to all sorts of interesting and useful answers. Another instance in which I was slow to apply what I should have known was the more general problem of criminal deterrence. So let me sort of briefly recite what I take to be James Q. Wilson's theory about crime and punishment as expressed in Thinking About Crime, a very important and really quite brilliant book. Wilson's point is criminals are rational. They do crime if crime pays. In the United States, crime pays. Therefore, we have a lot of crime. If we were more effective and efficient and ruthless at catching and punishing criminals, then crime wouldn't pay, and then we'd have less crime. Well, so I did some analysis based on that. I took the data for, well, 1976 was the trough year. Took all of the residential burglaries in the United States. It's possible to count those, not very accurately, but accurately enough. And it's possible to count the number of people behind bars for burglary charges, either in prisons or in jails. If you multiply that number by 365, you have the total days served for burglary that year, divided by the number of burglaries, assume steady state for just a moment, and you have the expected value of punishment for a burglary. And when you did that, long division, the answer you got was 6 days. The expected value of punishment for a burglary was 6 days. And my reaction when I was doing this analysis at the Justice Department was, first, oh my God, the fascists are right. I hate it, but I've got to agree with Jim Wilson. We're under-punishing burglary. We need to build more prisons. Well, arguably, we did need to build more prisons, though those of us who thought so back then are now in the position of the sorcerer's apprentice, wondering where the hell the off switch is on this machine. But it was only some years later that I actually did the vicarious problem solving and said, well, wait a second. If I were a burglar, would 6 days expected be a lot or a little? Well, you do a little arithmetic, you can discover that the average take for a burglary, once the burglar's finished fencing whatever he's stolen, is on the order of $240. Divided by 6. $40 a day. That's for 24 hours spent behind bars. McDonald's pays better. Or as Peter Reuter once said, the wages of sin are well below the legal minimum. So in fact, crime didn't pay, even at the trough. Now the current, if you did the same burglary analysis today, the answer you'd get would be 36 days, because we've more than tripled our prison capacity and burglary has fallen by about a factor of 2. So crime didn't pay then, and it really doesn't pay now. Retail drug dealing is worse, by the way. Some of you may know Venkatesh's studies in Chicago showing that retail crack dealers are literally getting less than the minimum wage, even ignoring the fact that they might get shot or addicted or sent to prison. Paper is entitled, Why Do Retail Drug Dealers Live with Their Mothers? So now you have to ask the question, okay, if crime doesn't pay, why does so many people do it and keep doing it even after they've been caught? Well, that gets us to imperfect rationality and deficient self-command. You have to ask how much people know about the actual costs and benefits of burglary. If you think about optimistic biases, or short-sightedness, or impulsiveness, or simple failures of self-command, you might decide, well, okay, people do crime even though it doesn't pay, either because they haven't noticed that yet, or because the immediate temptation, not only of what you can get from the crime, but the pleasure of committing it successfully, overwhelms the long-term cost. So, as has been said earlier today, I think Schelling's the first behavioral economist, noticing that not just that there's irrational behavior in the world, that's certainly no surprise, but that even people who aren't expected utility maximizers can still be responsive to the law of demand. That we needn't just throw up our hands when it turns out that behavior doesn't perfectly match our most abstract economic models. We can start to model, mostly economically, their behavior, just remembering that maybe some of the weights in the equations aren't what we thought they might be. Of course, the other insight of the self-command papers is that in trying to change somebody else's behavior, particularly if the behavior is self-destructive, like petty crime or drug dealing or drug abuse, you're not merely trying to impose your will on somebody else. You're likely working with part of that person's personality against another part, with the adult against the inner child. You're trying to help the adult send the inner child to his room. It's a strategic interaction, and timing is likely to matter quite a lot. So an example, again, from the drug abuse field. Lots of people, and this is one of the examples in the original self-command paper, lots of people want to quit some drug habit they have, whether it's caffeine or nicotine or cannabis or cocaine or methamphetamine or heroin. They really wish they didn't do that. Their drug taking is, as Tom said in that paper, feared in advance and deprecated in retrospect. And yet, they do it. Well, if you're a heroin addict, the good news is you can take a drug, naltrexone, take it once a day. Once you've taken it, you've made your decision. Doesn't matter whether you take heroin that day, it simply won't affect you because the naltrexone will block the receptors. There are some side effects, but it's a pretty effective way to do it. And if you catch an MD dipping into the medicine cabinet and put him on a rule where a nurse shows up every morning and watches him take his naltrexone, that's going to work pretty well. Not as easy to do with the typical underclass heroin user. Well, recently there's been developed, people are developing, a series of drugs that are essentially immunotherapies, vaccines, that stimulate the immune system to capture the individual molecules of cocaine or nicotine or heroin before they get to the brain. And if you do that, for the next 6 months, roughly, that person will simply not be able to get any psychic effect from taking his favorite drug of abuse. It looked wonderful in the open label trials. Now it doesn't look quite so good. But in principle, it's a brilliant intervention. And why is it a brilliant intervention? Because it changes the decision about not using drugs, right? So having a blocker like naltrexone changes the decision from a moment-to-moment decision where you could backslide at any instant and are likely to be terrified of that, and the tension build to the point where you simply want to take the drug to get rid of the tension. Changes from that to a daily behavior. But if you can get the immunotherapy working, then somebody could decide now not to use his favorite drug for the next 6 months. As Herb Kleber has once said, if somebody has a defective leg, a weak leg, we might want to give him a prosthetic device to strengthen the leg. Lots of drug abuse therapy consists of providing prostheses for weak wills. Focal points. A riot is a focal point. If the riot's going on, it makes sense to steal in a way that it wouldn't make sense if the riot weren't going on. And it's quite likely that there are frequently in a given city lots of people who would like to have a riot but don't know how to quite organize it. A drug market is a focal point. I don't want to go sell drugs in a place where people aren't going to come to buy drugs. And I don't want to come to buy drugs in a place where people aren't going to come to sell drugs. And in addition, of course, having buyers and sellers together protects all of them from police in the same way that herding behavior protects prey from predators. What that suggests is that breaking up a retail drug market, and the immediate reaction is, well, if you break up the market, it will just go away and reform somewhere else. But if you're thinking strategically, you say, how? Who's going to put up the billboard saying, oh, the market's here now? So it may be that if you can break up a street market, you can have a lasting effect, not necessarily on the volume of drugs sold, but on the level of violence and disorder surrounding flagrant retail drug dealing. And that then gets you back to the vicarious problem-solving question. Okay, what does the market need that I could deny it? Well, if we think about the focal point nature of a drug market, that it can't exist without some critical mass of buyers and sellers, then we might find ourselves in a tipping situation. We might discover that unless the market reaches a given size, it will evaporate. And in particular, that if we can bring it below that size even temporarily, it may not want to grow back. Now, it's been demonstrated that you can break up a retail drug market. Operation Pressure Point in Lower Manhattan broke up the largest and longest lasting open drug market in the United States. I've seen the video of the heroin buyers lining up in double lines before the tables of the drug dealers, and the dealers actually hired line monitors to keep, these were New Yorkers after all, to keep people from cutting into line. That market had been going on roughly forever. As it happened, the new police commissioner in New York had to drive through Alphabet City on his way to police headquarters. And after a few months, he just got tired. He just couldn't stand the fact that this place was so completely out of control, and announced that the department was going to crack down. They put 1,000 police officers in about a 12-square-block area, left them there for 6 months. They made 17,000 felony arrests. And the market broke up and did not come back. But they had, in the meantime, paralyzed the entire New York City criminal justice system with 17,000 new felony cases. Turned out there's a certain number of convictions you can get out of a court system, and the additional 17,000 arrests led to no additional convictions. So they knew that they couldn't try this again. But my friend David Kennedy and I were sitting around talking about Pressure Point and why it was going to be hard to replicate. And one of us, it's not clear who, said, well, wait a second. The problem is that those arrests are costly. And the arrests only last until the dealers figure out that you really do intend to keep arresting them until it goes away. So what would happen if we decided to do a crackdown and put up posters first? As of April 1st, this market is closed. Don't be here selling on April 1st or you will be arrested. Now, if you did that, who's going to show up on April 1st? Not many people, you'd think. And if not many people show up, all the ones who do get arrested. And so your prophecy has become self-fulfilling through a tipping process. And once you've tipped the market out of existence, there's no particular reason to think it will come back. Well, it only took about an additional 20 years, but David Kennedy actually managed to persuade the authorities of High Point, North Carolina, to break up their biggest drug market that way. And it's a long story, which you can read in the Wall Street Journal, but they broke up a 20-year-old drug market with 5 arrests and a bunch of signs and a bunch of meetings. And what they did was they actually gathered, they didn't just put up the warnings, they actually gathered felony cases against all of the dealers in the market. All of them was about 20, because after all, always looks like there's an infinite number of dealers in one of these markets, because when you arrest one, he's replaced. But in fact, when you took all of them out at once, there wasn't anybody left to replace them. So they made the buys, they called all the dealers together for a meeting, showed them the videotapes, said, okay, raise your hand when you see yourself committing a felony. Here's the ring binder with the case against you, including the warrant for the judge to sign. Now, if we smell you dealing, you're going to go to prison. The market evaporated and has not come back. Which, again, illustrates a Schelling point that the perfect threat is one that never has to be carried out. And a pretty damn good threat is one that doesn't have to be carried out very often. So it turns out that that applies to breaking up drug markets. It also applies to controlling probationers. And that gets me to the notion of a simple simulation and a checkerboard model. Oops, let me back this up. I'm sorry. Oh, good, excellent. Sorry. Good. Fantastic, thank you. All right, so here's the checkerboard. So, each square, 100 squares, each one is, let's say, a probationer. And they're identical up to one difference, which is that they have different propensities to use cocaine. Some use a lot of it and some use a little of it. We'll measure that in terms of the probability of using on any given day or in any given testing period. The light color is a low probability. The dark color is a high probability. Thank you. Is a high probability. And you can see at the top left, I've set it so there's an equal probability between 5% and 95%. You're the probation officer, and you're trying to control this behavior. Let's assume it's transparent because you're doing drug testing. But you have a limited capacity to impose sanctions. That could be imposed by your own workday or by the tolerance of the judge for dealing with the cases. So every round, randomly, each user uses or doesn't, each probationer uses or doesn't, depending on the underlying probability and random chance. The circle represents somebody who's used. The slash represents somebody who's been punished. You've only got 8 sanctions to hand out, so you can't punish all 50 people who violated this round. But you're a fair-minded person. So you give every violator the same chance of being punished. That sounds like a reasonable thing to do. And let's see what happens. You see on the bottom left, the average probability is going up. The screen's getting red. And of course, the more people who violate, the safer it is for any given violator. And so we wind up punishing 8 people every round and getting absolutely no benefit out of it. We're not controlling their behavior at all. And if this were really a tipping model, what we'd expect is that if you had more sanctions, let's say you had 20 sanctions to hand out every round, that would turn out to start to push the violation rate down. And of course, once it starts to go down, it's going to go all the way down. So yes, indeed, this is a tipping situation. There's a critical value of the number of sanctions. It turns out to be about 15 on these assumptions. All I've assumed, by the way, is that people who get caught are less likely to use next time, and people who get away with it are more likely to use next time. In some joint work with Bo Kilmer at Rand, we've done this in a full rational actor model with Bayesian updating. It still works. Now, again, in a tipping situation, what you'd expect is that if you started out with a well-behaved group, right, say people all of whose probability is at 5%, and you have 8 sanctions available, that those 8 sanctions, which remember were completely inadequate to control an ill-behaved group, perfectly adequate to control a well-behaved group. All right, so that's a nice story, and it suggests that if the probation officer could somehow magically multiply his capacity for just a little while. In earlier versions of this paper, I referred to this as a temporary surge in enforcement capacity. I'm not using that phrase anymore. So the question is, who's going to bell the cat? I mean, where are you going to find that extra enforcement capacity from? So actually, let me just, for the moment, leave this as a puzzle for the group, though I do have the answer just sitting right here. If you were the probation officer and you realize that a temporary surge would help, but you don't have the temporary surge available, is there anything you can do within the constraints you're given, right? We're back now to only having 8 sanctions. Is there anything you can do to tip this situation in the right direction? Assume for the moment you can't either increase the severity or the probability of sanctioning. That is, you only got 8 sanctions and they're no more effective than they were before. Well, one way to think about it is, imagine you had those 8 sanctions, but you only had 8 subjects. Well, then none of them would ever get away with it. Then they'd stop. Then you could maybe move on to some additional subjects. So I propose that we change the sanctioning rule so that every person on the checkerboard, every individual, has a number. Top left is number 1, bottom right is number 100. And our rule is that the lowest numbered violators get sanctioned. Now, for this model, it doesn't matter how you assign the numbers, but you could do it based on severity. You could do it based on previous violations. You could do it on age, first in, last in. Doesn't much matter. So what's going to happen if I apply sanctions this way? Well, notice that the people in the first 2 rows never get away with it. And once they figure out that they're never going to get away with it, they stop doing it. And then the pressure starts coming further down. Notice, if you look at the bottom left, the overall probability in the group is still going up. But that can't last for long. The pressure just keeps coming down. Remember, pressure never goes off those first people, just they're not using up very much of it. And the same number of sanctions that was completely ineffective is now completely effective. Not only do you get better behavior, you get fewer sanctions actually applied. Actually, that's a point I should have made about the heavy sanctions, the 20 sanctions model. Having 20 sanctions available meant not only getting better behavior, it meant using fewer sanctions. Having an adequate amount of sanctions capacity is not only more effective, it's less cruel than having not enough sanctions capacity, right? This is the old rule that if you have to cut off a dog's tail, it's not merciful to do it a little bit at a time. Okay, so that was a somewhat longer exposition than all of my work on drugs and crime that wasn't influenced by Tom Schelling, but I hope it gives you some sense of what can be done with these models. And I should say, we're now getting some real-world applications of this. Not only the High Point drug crackdown, but Hawaii has now started to use this to enforce probation conditions and is getting both increases in compliance and decreases in the number of days that those probationers spend in jail. I'm convinced that using nothing that we don't already know, using nothing we haven't learned from Tom Schelling, we could have half as much crime and half as many people in prison in this country in 10 years. And I hope we will. Thanks.
Okay, fantastic. I want to start out by asking Tom if Tom wants to make any remarks about any of the papers before we open it up for questioning. Tom?
This whole day has been the most fascinating conference I've ever attended. And I'm so pleased not only at how they've performed, but who you got. And so I just want to say this has been terrific all day long, and this panel is no exception.
Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to open it up for, yes, please. Do we have any questions or comments from the audience about any of the papers? People are hungry, are tired.
You should call people up, but only low social security numbers.
Yeah, we're going to start from the back corner of the room, and we're going to work our way through, and sooner or later.
You should call it Mike. He volunteered.
Yeah, Mike, did you have anything else? Yes.
Just now you mentioned that there will be a chance for people not to know the rules. It's actually crime doesn't pay, but they still do it because they don't know the rule. Is it akin to people going to the casino? Actually, they know the rule. They know the odds are against them, but they still think there's a chance this time the burglary will bring a higher income. I'm grateful for your advice.
Sure. So it seems to me there are at least four things that can be at work here. Right. One is literal ignorance. Right. People just make the wrong guess. Second possibility is that they know the objective probabilities, but are subject to some sort of optimistic bias. They believe that they're more skillful than average, or they believe that they're luckier than average. And notice, in an activity where the probability of a bad outcome is low, which is true of burglary, right? The probability of being arrested for a burglary is less than 1 in 20. So anytime you are arrested, anytime you're not arrested, of course, that proves that you're smart and you can get away with it. Anytime you are arrested is either the product of extraordinary stupidity or extraordinary bad luck. And so that allows the burglar to say, well, that won't happen next time. I've learned my lesson. Now I can go back and do it again. So yes, there can be misestimates even if people know the objective truth. But in addition, people even knowing their own probabilities, may be reckless, they may be impulsive, they may simply be poorly self-controlled. So people can want to stop a behavior like burglary and find themselves tempted to do it again. So I don't think there's any simple answer, but it's pretty clear that if it really is a bad deal, the more clear you can make it to people that it's really a bad deal, the better you'll do and the better they'll do. So the judge in Hawaii in the probation case was going to start a program of consistent sanctioning and went to the public defender to just get his approval that his assistance would be available for the hearings. And the public defender said, well, you're going to warn him first, aren't you? I don't know whether the public defender had read Schelling or not, but that was clearly the right question. It turns out that half the people who get the warning because they've been chronically misbehaving never misbehave again once they know there's going to be a consequence. So you can really economize on punitive force by directly communicating the threat. I hope that answers your question.
Can I just say one
Yeah,
thing?
sure.
It's actually more of an aside. This is you mentioned the drug the drug they're developing for self-control. In New Jersey, there is a program where you can sign up so that casinos in New Jersey are prohibited from ever allowing you to gamble there, and they also share it with other cooperating states. And so there's currently a lawsuit of a guy who signed up and is trying to get out of it.
I propose something. So that's for the real serious compulsive gambler. But I've always wondered why places like New Jersey and Las Vegas don't have a rule that, look, if you're going to gamble here, you have to sign up at least a day in advance, and you have to announce a day in advance how much you're going to lose. And that's your limit. You can't keep gambling once you've lost. I think the answer is, well, no, they make their money on the people.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think I
get
know
out of
why
control.
Las Vegas hasn't passed that rule.
But it seems to me, just like the menu example, right? If you make people order their lunch at 9:30 in the morning, they eat fewer calories. If you make people decide in advance how much they're going to lose, they'd lose less.
I think I saw a hand. Yeah.
A question that deals with scaling up from micromotives to macro behavior. And when I used to teach this stuff, one of the issues that students were always interested in was the self-forming neighborhood that Tom goes through with this 8x8 matrix. And one of the questions I would have is, if you go to a 50 by 50 matrix, one of the things is that the area is much larger. The ratio of the area to the perimeter is much larger. And I think that in the 8 by 8 matrix, a lot of the problems are induced by the limitations imposed by there being a perimeter. And so the scaling up question is not that you lose all of the intuition or insights, but that it may not be as powerful, although it raises other issues that maybe little communities rather than big communities are the ones where these modest preferences make themselves felt more strongly. But I think that the scaling up issue, I mean, it's also an issue for me in looking at bilateral contracts and asking whether or not this has anything to say about the modern corporation and the like. And it may have relevance to experimental economics and whether or not that scales up to deal with issues of organization as well. So I just throw it out there if there's reactions that Tom or anyone has on this.
Yeah, I didn't mean to seem inattentive by looking at my slides here, but it turns out I don't have the slides with me, but I just want to mention I'm actually looking at this question and this sort of meta-analytic work I'm doing, and it scales up surprisingly well, but both in aggregate diffusion of innovation studies, but I've also been doing some simulations where I vary the scope of vision of how many of your neighbors you're aware of, and you certainly get a drop-off depending on how far your scope of vision is. But empirically, I'm finding that you can get these tipping phenomena even.
But Ollie's right on this neighborhood thing when it's 8 by 8 versus 90 by 90. And I remember building these having kids build these simulation models as part of a classroom exercise. And as long as it was a checkerboard, you would quickly get these things to go to the extreme because of it's the edge phenomenon. And if you have a really dense thing that's got lots of interior, eventually it'll get there often. But it won't get to the same places, obviously, but it takes much more time. And I remember sort of seeing that again and again and again. As you increase the size and reduce the importance of the perimeter, the thing starts to
take some exception to that because it hinges on a key assumption that the visibility of other people drops off as a sort of Euclidean distance. If, in fact, you have a brother-in-law who lives in some other neighborhood, or you get an email from someone in another neighborhood, I mean, if you look at these so-called small worlds networks where you have these connections that cross geographic space, then I think that conclusion breaks down. And so a lot of it hinges on whether you have points of contact with people that are farther away in. The social space can be closer than geographic space, I guess is what I'm saying. And so, if you have those connections to someone, even though they're distant, you can reinstitute this phenomenon. So, Mark.
If the problem is literally the perimeter, then at least in one dimension you can wrap it, right? You can always eliminate the perimeter by making it cyclical, so that when you go off to the left, you come in from the right. Well, twisting it would probably be extreme.
Other comments, questions? Was that a hand or no? Yes, sorry.
I think you covered this already a little bit in the last round, but I'd still appreciate a reaction. Would the technique of essentially concentrating enforcement, would that be a good way to summarize? Also work to inspire people? Or do you have any reason to believe, do you have any evidence or knowledge, as well as enforce sanctions? That would be question number one. And number two would be related to what was just discussed. If you did work, if your potential audience of inspiring was the population of the world, that was your ultimate goal, say for inspiring common ethics and such, or ethical behavior, would it be best to concentrate geographically or by rank and status and activity sector first? Or are both equally wise?
Do you have any?
I have no insight. I should note that in some of the enforcement stuff, there's been an inspiration component. I mean, my account left it out, but there's been an inspiration component. Well, basically energizing the community to say to the offenders, who are, after all, their relatives and neighbors, look, you know, we love you, but you really got to cut this stuff out. And so that does turn out to be an important component. But on your theoretical question, I have no insight.
You know, on that point, I heard someone say out loud while you were talking about the idea of if you have 8 sanctions, you pick 8 people to, and I heard someone in the audience say something about, say, race, that race might be the criterion, and I could see how someone could jump to the conclusion that this kind of enforcement strategy might be concentrated, right? And so I just wanted to give you a chance to respond to that if you wanted to.
Well, it is likely to be concentrated. Crime is concentrated racially, I mean, to a shocking extent, right? If you look at either murder victims or murderers, in the United States, somewhere between 40 and 50% are black. So there's not as if we could subtract race out of this. And in fact, the argument I make is that of all the public services that we deliver, even education, the one that's delivered most unequally by race is public safety. Right? If we have a constitutional obligation to deliver equal protection of the laws, well, we're not doing it. Burglarizing my apartment is much more dangerous than burglarizing the apartment of somebody in South LA. So there is a problem that there's going to be a transition. Direct communication may be one way to reduce the size of that transition cost.
We should bring this to a close, and I'm going to turn the podium over to Michael Nock to wrap up.
Well, thank you very much for a fantastic panel, and thank you all for sticking with us now for 7.5 hours. Let me just mention that if you're interested, all of these proceedings are going to be webcast on the Goldman School's website, www.gspp.berkeley.edu, which some people say, oh, that's so 2000, that's so old. It's also going to be broadcast on itunes.berkeley.edu. That's not 2000. And we're wrestling with ways in which we can have some written output as well, some hard copy, as they say. I want to thank the members of the committee who made all this happen, John Quigley, Bob Powell, Robb MacCoun, and Rich Gilbert. I want to thank Alumni House for providing a lovely setting, all the panelists who have just been off the charts wonderful. I want to thank Tom and Alice for being with us today, and I want to thank Tom Schelling for his life's work. So thank you all for coming.